wants to deliver as part of the SDR deliverables. And I think that will be an important part of our overall level of resilience. And I'll be completely honest, we don't have a good plan right now to do that.
Okay, well, thank you for your honesty with that. I'm going to move on to a separate area now, away from reserves. So to speak about defence reform.
Yeah.
We had your predecessor in front of this committee twice, I think. Once shortly before he was due to go. He then finished and made a speech, his first appearance in public since leaving the role, and you kind of never quite know what people are going to say once they're no longer not shackled, but you know what I mean. They're free to speak.
Not gagged.
Gagged. That was the word I was looking for. Yeah. What he said was that he tried very hard to change culture in the MOD and in the forces, and that he couldn't, and that it was kind of really, really tough to change culture. Part of defence reform vision that we've heard is around culture. And that kind of culture of, attitudes to women and minorities in the forces, or it could be culture in terms of risk aversion in procurement, or it could be any number of things. I want to ask you specifically about the risk aversion in procurement, which is something that multiple people in defence have spoken to us about. And this basically is that for civil servants and uniformed people making decisions about what to trial and eventually procure, there's really no incentive to take risk because you're liable to be sued by defence companies and you're putting your career on the line. So culturally leads to a situation of stasis. And that, that's not your words, but that's what I've heard from a lot of people. Do you have any plans to try and shift that culture?
The short answer is yes, we have to. It's not a matter of do we want to, we have to. And particularly because of speed and speed of adaptation. I've been out to Ukraine 3 times in the time I've been CDS. And one of the things that is really plain when you go to visit is how everybody through the system has a clear understanding of the requirement, the threat, the need to do something, and is able and willing to balance that need with the risk that they're able to take. So I'm on record as saying that what we have done in defence over the last 30, 40 years is optimise a system for driving cost out. And we've optimised it for the 20th century, not necessarily for the 21st century. That's led to highly transactional relationships with industry, where we have tried to lay off risk on industry, and industry has tried to protect itself from that risk. And that was at a time when we weren't facing a threat from Russia. We wouldn't face the need to change as quickly, and that is not going to be adequate for the future. I don't think it's fair to say that throughout the whole of defence procurement system no risk is taken. If that were true, then we wouldn't necessarily have some of the challenges we have in
I don't think I said that, to be fair.
In a number of areas. And I think that how this works in Ukraine and in other nations that face these existential threats, and how it worked in the UK, if you read about what we did during the Second World War, is a real clarity around the need to change and a delegation of an empowerment of people to make those trade-offs between the risks that you face, whether that be in procurement terms or maybe even in assurance, versus the benefit that you get from delivery. And it's about creating that environment to do that. So you will have seen in the SDR, and I think Rupert talked about it when he came before the committee previously, this idea of segmenting procurement.
I will just quote him because we have heard in some detail from, as you say, from Mr. Pearce, who's the new National Armaments Director, about segmentation and the staff who were with him. But my last question to you, and it's interesting you mentioned that previous panel we had with the new National Armaments Director. One of the questions I asked them was, culturally, the direction in the MOD, is it to prepare for some kind of future conflict that might happen in the 30s, as in 2035, which is one of the dates where we've currently committed to hit certain funding categories, which is it's so far away that it's, you know, policy can change so much between now and then. Or is it to get ready to fight and win in the next couple of years? If Russia's fixed in Ukraine at the moment, if there is a ceasefire this year and discussions for deals are well underway now, then it might shift its gaze and we might be drawn into conflict, and suddenly conversations about spending X, Y, Z in 2035 seem a bit far-fetched, or rather irrelevant. I asked them, and they told me, ask CDS when he comes to funding. So that's what they said on record. This is what I said.
Did I read it?
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
So perhaps slightly obvious answer is you have to do both. So I talk about being ready to fight today and tomorrow and together. The today bit is about how do we maximise the output that we can get from the kit we've got today, and that's about investing in spares, it's about investing in activity. And at the same time, we also have to recognise that our enemy is changing, is adapting, and we need to be able to keep up with that. So you have to kind of do both. What the defence reform does, partly to Mr Bailey's point, is it provides much greater clarity over the problem statement coming from the military, and much greater delegation to the National Armament Director to go to industry to work out how best to solve that. And if that works, what that delivers is a faster response to specific problems we face. And we've got good examples of where we did this. If you think about the counter IED fight in Afghanistan, when Mr Joppa and I worked together previously, actually we did that remarkably well. And it was because we had a very clear threat and a very clear requirement to do better. And that's the culture that we've got to bring in. But I'll be honest with you, it is difficult. If you take somebody like me, I've spent 30 plus years in the armed forces, and we've been doing it the same way that whole time. To shift that mindset requires real clarity over the requirement, the threat, and then delegating and empowering our people to do those things. And when things go wrong, because they might do if you take more risk, is we acknowledge they've gone wrong and we say it was in the greater good, and I may be using that defence in front of the committee at some point.
Well, you're welcome to. You would be welcome to in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Lincoln Jopp wants to come in on this point as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. I think we probably had a pretty similar briefing when the committee went to Ukraine, and what was so telling was the way in which they had completely bypassed a load of stuff in order to get the responsiveness to the ever-evolving threat. And if we looked at what they had cut out, and they'd effectively cut out the whole of the military chain of command above brigade level, they'd cut out the whole of the Ministry of Defence, and they'd cut out every single regulator. Now, if you want the responsiveness that you're talking about, institutions get the behaviours they reward. And you just said, you spent 30 years in the armed forces doing it in one way, which you've now acknowledged should be wrong. But the institutions get the behaviours that they reward, and they rewarded you with becoming CDS. And so, how are you going to meet this challenge? But you've grown up and been successful in a system that you now have to say, we completely need to change that wholesale, and I'm the man to lead it.
So I think the point I'm trying to make is that that is a part of the acquisition system, which under the new model is the National Armament Director. What I can do as the head of the armed forces in this new model is be super clear about what the specific problem statements and requirements are, and be prepared to accept that we won't, in this new model, drive towards precise requirements 20 years in the future, but instead focus on what are we going to be able to deliver this year, next year, or this week, next week, and the week after. And that's the model that defence reform is trying to bring into place. What that will require is changes in regulation, changes in process, and it will require us to accept failure when it occurs, and to acknowledge that that was in pursuit of the greater good. And what gives me some confidence around this is that when we look at those circumstances where we have had that very clear requirement, we have swept away some of that process. We've swept away some of that regulation that has accreted and built up over 25, 30 years of the peace dividend. And I'm not in any way pretending that is easy, and I'm not in any way pretending that we can be complacent and it will naturally just happen. But I think we've seen the importance of it in Ukraine, and we've seen an example of how it can be done in Ukraine. And let's be honest, the Ukrainian system is not without its flaws or problems as well. And right now we're not at war, and that the challenge is how do we create that sense of urgency without creating this sense of panic and throwing all of the regulations that are established by this place out of the window, and that will be a consistent effort to carve that away over time.
Thank you. Mike Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if I might touch on homeland preparedness and resilience. So, I mean, you'll know very well, NATO Article 3 mandates that we should continuously, I'm just quoting, and effectively maintain and develop our individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. And that specifically, speaks to this question of national resilience, both in a military sense and in a non-military sense as well. How would you say we're doing on that?
Not as well as I would want us to. I mean, that was really the central element of my speech at RUSI, is that we, those of us in this community, are familiar with the issues and risks, and we talk about it all the time. But it is not at the front of our minds right across the nation. And the example I gave in my RUSI speech was a report, really excellent report done by the Royal Academy of Engineering about infrastructure and about the need to rebuild infrastructure around things like flood defences, railways, etc. And I could agree with all of the elements in there, but at no point did it talk about doing it to build in resilience for the risk that we might come with armed attack or sabotage. And so we have to bring those things more to the fore. The Cabinet, following the publication of the National Security Strategy and the SDR, the Cabinet Office lead across government work to enhance these this thinking in these areas and to deliver those things. But this isn't free and isn't going to happen overnight. And I judge, and I've argued, that this, in a world where the demands on defence and the nation are rising, the risks are rising, that is a time when we should be contemplating and examining how we increase the resilience of the nation more broadly. So as we think about replacing upgrading signalling on railways, is how do we build in the redundancy associated with that? We talked about the National Health Service earlier. How do we think about holding stockpiles or building capacity and resilience to support us in mass casualty events? And that work is really relatively new and really getting going. And I know that the team in the Cabinet Office have said that they would be very happy to come and talk to the committee about it if that were helpful.
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely about, is that bridge built to do X under duress? And there's a mindset shift as well. So I'm an MP for a constituency that suffered repeated water outages, including a 2-week one before Christmas. And towards the end of that, we had bad actors playing in the social media space around the water quality. So actually, you're a water company, you think your job is to supply water, but all of a sudden you're dealing with malicious disinformation. And we did actually have to ask the Cabinet Office to get involved there. And I agree with you that stuff costs money, but plans are cheap. So do we have a national defence plan?
We don't have a complete national defence plan
Shouldn't
yet.
we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the government is committed to doing that.
Why don't we have one?
So I think that it is a manifestation of the peace dividend. It's one of the most obvious, is that since the end of the Cold War, we have not prioritised those matters, and so as a consequence, the government for many years has not, of many hues, has not focused its efforts on developing that kind of plan. I'm pleased to say that partly as a consequence of what's in the Strategic Defence Review, that is changing. And
when are we going to have the plan?
So I would say that you will... The complete national defence plan, that is a question for Cabinet Office.
As we're mandated to do, right? We signed a treaty.
Inside defence, which is a component of it, we have a plan called Operculus, which is forms the basis of our national defence plan, and we will evolve and develop that over this year, and it will be an ongoing thing. But we will have a plan that I can point to where I understand the command and control arrangements, I understand how we will transition through war through this year.
And are you aware of any other NATO countries that don't have national defence plans?
There are a number. I don't know the exact which nations, and some nations don't talk about it in public. And I think it's fair to say that nations may describe themselves as having a national defence plan, but they're a variable depth of detail across all of those different nations. Our job should be to focus on us and making sure we have the plan that we need.
Would you say that it's sort of letting the side down to not have one?
I think, as you said yourself, NATO expects us to have a national defence plan, and that's why we need to work on it and build it.
Thank you very much. On to Alex Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Marshal, it's a delight to have you in front of us. I want to talk to you a bit about defence reform, which you've obviously already picked up a bit on in some of the previous answers, but I just want to give you an opportunity to sort of put on the record how defence reform is going. You've had the programme underway for a year now. How are the new structures enabling you to deliver outcomes, and what difference does it make having the service chiefs reporting directly to you?
Please. Was the SDR said defence reform is the work of a whole Parliament, but our initial structures are in place with the CDS, the National Armament Director, Permanent Secretary, and the Chief of Defence Nuclear, and our responsibilities and accountabilities are clear. The underpinning processes, alignments of budgets, particularly the establishment of the portfolios of acquisition and how they are organised and what they face off to. That work is still ongoing. The 1st of April 26 is the key date that we've set ourselves, but there will continue to need to be evolution of the systems over the subsequent years. In terms of how it's helping, I think that if you look at the way in which the COS committee has been operating, Chief of Staff committee has been operating, we spend more time together now. I think the conversations are at a more strategic level and are focused on building, a lot of it has been focused on the integrated force plan and how that will fit inside the defence investment plan. So I think that those are positive changes. But ultimately,
clear-cut examples of how it's really tangibly made a difference so far?
So I think I'd say the most obvious are when I talk to my ops people, and the clarity that comes with an element of that group being responsible for policy and another element responsible for military strategy is provide really clear choices and sharper divide or brought into sharper focus the choices that we're offering to ministers. And I think when you talk to my folks as part of that organisation and the permanent secretaries folks, they would point to those opportunities, and it's allowed us to spend more time talking about military strategy and how that fits together and nest that within the policy. But I think ultimately the big question will be, can we drive the pace that Mr. Job talks about? Can we ensure that we deliver cost effectively against those set of requirements? And that will take some time. The other thing I would want to emphasise is that whilst we talk about clarity of responsibility across the 4 pillars, I'm really clear that we don't deliver for the country or defence unless we work together. So if we think about exports, for example, the National Armament Director isn't going to sell very much if the armed forces aren't prepared to go and spend time with the other nations to describe how we use them. And so it's the collective responsibility that will deliver the overall outcome, but the clarity over those requirements and the sharper dividing line makes it easier for us to understand how our performance is, how we are performing. And so, for example, I now undertake quarterly reviews with the commands and their people about what it is we're asking them to do, how they're getting on with it, and how head office and how the other parts of defence can support them to deliver. That was not a thing that happened previously, and I hope ultimately that will enable us to deliver more for defence.
Thank you. We will continue to ask this question every year, and so hopefully we'll come back with more and more tangible examples of greatly improved pace and value for money, etc. I want to actually just pick up on, I know when my colleague Calvin Bailey was asking you about, you and the chiefs all being on the same page. I mean, for me, it was obviously really clear that you obviously set the demand signal, and they report into you, and that you are, you've said you are on the same page. But I think, it was quite interesting to see at DSCI, the chiefs going on the, being given speaking slots, seeing everybody, sort of taking their opportunity to put their pitch in for why their, work was important. How confident are you that you can genuinely exercise this central authority? If the chiefs are continuing to be able to sort of go out and brief out their pitch, basically.
I want the chiefs to be talking about their specialist domain. I want Harv to talk about the air domain, and Gwyn to talk about maritime, and Rowley to talk about land, and Jim to talk about cyber and specialist operations. I want them to do that. They are the experts in their domains. They have a really important role to play. But you can understand that what we have to do is try to integrate those things to create an integrated force. And the really significant change with defence reform is that the tasking and the money flows through the CDS in a way that it hasn't done in the past, and that provides us with the opportunity to do that. But until we get the defence budget and the defence plan in balance, then it's going to be difficult for us to really make inroads, and that's why the defence investment plan is so important.
So I come from the private sector, and so I am really getting to know how the MOD works in a way I just didn't before. And in the private sector, when a business commits to a process of change, generally, in my experience, what happens is, the business brings in people who really specialise in transformation, in change, in, specifically finance. You've got a team of, highly competent people running defence reform, but they are people, from what I can see, with military backgrounds, not necessarily with that specialist knowledge. Is there a different way of doing this?
So just to be clear, that the head of the transformation programme has come from outside defence. Gaby has. She has a mixed team inside working for her, which she does include some small number of military officers and civil servants, but also she has specialist help from a range of external assistance from consultants with specific expertise in this, and they've been brought in deliberately to do the things that you describe.
Right. But I mean, it's good to hear that there are some of those skills being brought in-house. I mean, I think it is important, to have them in-house rather than, consultants, telling you from sort of externally. Is there a scope for more of that, more specialism being brought in from outside to drive change?
The government's been very clear that it doesn't want to spend more money on consultancy and external assistance, but also recognises there are some areas where there is limited expertise inside the organisation, and in those specific cases, then yes, we will bring people in from outside.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got just under 25 minutes, so there's still a lot of ground to cover. So my request to members and to your good self, Chief of Defence Staff, is that our questioning and answers are as concise as possible, starting off with Lincoln Job.
Thanks, Chair. You said in response to Alex's question that you think that as a result of defence reform, the building is better at doing military strategy.
No, I said we had more time to spend focused on military strategy, which keep going, sorry.
On, I think, around June 1943, one of your predecessors, Field Marshal Allenbrook, wrote in his diary that he was, the thing that was really vexing him was how did he beat Germany in such a way that it could regrow Germany to act as a counterbalance to Russia in the post-war conflict, long before, obviously, Normandy and the whole of that was happening. So what are you metaphorically or literally writing in your diary tonight?
So I don't write a diary. I don't have the time to do that. And I'm always amazed at what Allenbrook was able to do with the pressure that he was under. I think the thing that I am most bothered about in the near term is Russia, and how we get ourselves to a position where Russia concludes that they will not attack NATO or therefore undermine our national security, but also at the same time recognising that in holding conflict below the threshold, that there will inevitably be Russian activity below the threshold of war. And in doing that, what we need to work is how do we work across all of the agencies, all of the levers of government to protect UK from that risk. More broadly beyond that is that there's a changing shape and direction of source of power right across the globe. You can see it moving eastwards, and that's even before we talk about changes in US national security policy and strategy and how we bring those together. And therefore the question is, what is the role of the UK and particularly the armed forces in the UK to enable the stability and security that we've enjoyed over 80 years, and how that has enabled prosperity and ultimately growth for the nation, which is a key challenge for us. So that's the big questions I think we have to wrestle with. And we have an opportunity to do that sometimes now, which I'm not sure we always did in such a structured way before.
Right. Thank you very much. On to Emily.
Thank you. The defence world tends to not be great at conveying simple and straightforward messages to the public. You've spoken about having a national conversation about the risks that we face. Obviously, people in this room are aware of those risks, but how are you going to reach out to the wider population, have that national conversation?
Yeah. So I think armed forces and leaders in the armed forces particularly, but also right through our ranks, have a role to play in that. As I set out in my recent speech, the challenge is how do you have a conversation about a complex threat that sits within a wider geopolitical and geostrategic context that is uncertain and challenging. Because the danger is you fall back on simple tropes that Russia's going to invade by 27 or they're not going to invade by till 2035. And the reality is it's actually a matter of a judgment around the level of risk that we face. My core argument is that what we are seeing is an increasing risk as our adversary in Russia particularly becomes more capable, more battle-hardened, and we see a continued desire to undermine NATO and the stability of the West and the rules-based international system. And we should have those kind of debates in public. I think the polity have a critical role to play in that, and we can support that because of our understanding of the threats. But the role that our reserves play, the role our cadets play, the role that our regular services play in talking about what the armed forces do, I think is an important part of that national conversation.
I mean, just even listening to you there, CDS, if I was someone watching this and trying to understand what the risks are, I would have been lost off. Do you know, just the average person on the street, if we're going to try and get them to understand what the risk is, don't we need to be a bit more blunt and slightly more alarmist with them so that they understand it? Because like you said, people are living in a cosy bubble of the peace dividend, and actually that's not where we're at anymore. But I think every single time I hear anybody in defence talking about it, I think the average person will be lost off within 5 seconds and just get on with their day. It's about making sure that they actually understand, and I don't think the public are there yet. And if the public aren't there yet, then how are we going to get them to be resilient?
Yeah, I think it's a really fair challenge, and you as politicians, it's your job to communicate with society. My worry about being too blunt is that we scaremonger. My worry about being too relaxed is we're too complacent, and the reality is it's more complicated than that. And I would be happy to take advice from politicians on how to do that in an effective way. But I think if we are too alarmist, that is unnecessary. But equally, we can't be complacent either.
I mean, you'll be aware, CDS, that other countries, so I'm just looking at Norway and Finland have had military conscription for decades. I've got friends in Finland, and they'll talk quite openly about how, you know, they're always ready. Basically, they know that that's something as a nation they have to do. The Swedish government has their total defence strategy. Other governments send out booklets to their citizens to say this is what you would do in the event of a national attack or an attack on civil critical national infrastructure. There is nothing like that in the UK, not even the basics to let people know if this happens, this is what you need to do. I could go out now and ask anyone and say, what would you do in the event of an attack? And there would just be mass panic. So what can we do to avert that, I suppose what I'm saying.
I spoke recently about the Swedish model, where they have, I think it's annually, but certainly regularly, provide a booklet that goes out in Swedish, simple Swedish and English, and it talks about some of these issues. Some of it is about straightforward national resilience, so I suspect Mr Martin's constituents and the problems they had with water supply, it would cover off those things, but it also expands right the way out to armed attack. And it feels to me that those are the sorts of things that would be part of that wider national conversation. And they can be reassuring as well as realistic about the potential threats that we face. But it seems to me that we have to start with a description of what those things might be, admit that there's a degree of uncertainty about the likelihood of it happening, and then to use all of the means available to help educate society more broadly on what we might do. But it goes beyond straightforwardly thinking about whether you're going to store drinking water at home. It is about how do we encourage people to want to serve? How do we have the conversation with public that says we are going to spend more money on defence, and that will have consequences. And ultimately I think that is a political discussion, but we can help support that through the description of the threats.
And I think that's one of the central dilemmas, is the public don't accept more spending on defence because they're not fully aware of what the risk is, and that's something we're always battling with as members of Parliament. And until we get something clearly out there in an understandable format to the public, they're never going to accept that. Just another quick question from myself, Chair. The Defence Readiness Bill, do you know when that will be ready?
I don't. My understanding is that it depends on finding parliamentary time for it, and I know it's a key focus for Defence Readiness and Industry, DRA, Luke Pollard and the Defence Secretary, and they're determined to try and get it in during this Parliament, but I don't have a precise date.
Do you have any part to play in advising ministers what should be in that bill?
Yes, we will do. Yes, there'll be the military staffs will have a part to play in that, and describing some of the issues that we want. And clearly, it will require specialist drafters, because we don't often do bills in defence.
What do you think should be in it?
So, a range of things, but it will be about how do we government gain access to private assets in times of crisis? How do we shift industrial capacity to particular areas of focus in times of crisis, and mirroring laws and laws and rights that other governments have in other nations. The US is an example. Brilliant. So elements of those will be what we would need.
Okay. Thank you very much. On to Ian Rowe.
All right, thank you very much. Well, the time wraps here, so I'll be very quick. Air Chief Marshal, you mentioned at Russia, your speech on the 15th of December, that people are a critical role. In fact, the Rick Haythwaite also said that you know, people are a pivotal military capability just as much as a new submarine or fast jet. You also said a pleasing thing that this committee is, when we've had General McGowan in front of us, and we've had the Secretary of State, and also General Dame Sharon Neesmith come in front of this committee about the retention. And one thing shocked me, obviously, from the last reports that we heard, that we had more people exiting than actually being recruited. You said in that speech, the latest figures just a few weeks ago, which had been then beginning of January, showed that the first time in 4 years more people joined than left the forces in the past year, which I think is a big achievement. So coming on to the wider broadness of the question is, can you give the committee an update on the Haythwaite, the Haythornworth review, and your assessment of where the armed forces are in relation to recruitment and retention? Because I do know that we've had briefings about the pinch points, and those also where we've had to have given bonuses, which at the time one of our questions was, is this just sticking plasters? Because, you know, particularly around your trade, which engineering.
I mean, on the macro points, up to the 1st of October 25, which is the last time we had up-to-date data, more people had joined in the previous 12 months than had left. We've seen increases in those recruited. The Air Force was up to 37%. I think the Navy was about 24% increases in numbers of recruits, and we've seen a reduction in the number of people leaving. So I take all of those things as positive, but the net increase was only a few hundred over that year, and it needs to be bigger to fill in the gaps that have been created over the last few years where exits have exceeded inflow. There's a whole bunch of factors that will have played a part in that. Some of it is the financial retention incentives, some of it will be the pay rises, some of it will be for example, the defence housing strategy. Some of it is about greater flexibility, allowing our personnel to extend their services who want to. All of those add up to delivering the shift in position that you've described. I actually saw Rick Haythornworth last week to catch up with him because I was involved in his report. And effectively, his recommendations form the basis of the chapter in the Strategic Defence Review on people, and that is what we're driving at. You'll recall that Rick's report had, I think, 62 recommendations. That's a lot to get our arms around, so trying to the work as part of SDR delivery is focusing down on those things that are going to make the most difference in the short term. Part of that is about recruitment and retention, speeding that up and improving our retention numbers, and then the other part is really about providing that flexibility of service to ensure that we keep people in for as long as possible.
Lovely. And just a quick one. On our visits as a Defence Select Committee, we have travelled to different NATO countries and spoke to British personnel, serving personnel, who are in NATO positions. One thing that came across to me, and I've asked the ministers this question as well, is the SDR is truly NATO first, and we hear the terminology NATO first all the time. So what I'm picking up is sometimes when officers, serving officers or personnel are sent on NATO roles, it affects their promotion. This is what they're telling me, mainly because that another commanding officer may be from another NATO country, and it doesn't fit within the structures of what the career paths are set for people in those roles, because they've already got to come back and have experience of doing that role before they're considered for promotion. So if we're truly NATO first, how are you as CDS going to ensure that the culture changes so that actually their time spent in NATO command positions does not affect their promotion?
Well, actually, I want to do the opposite. I want to actually enhance their promotion prospects if people have been to NATO and then brought that experience back into the UK, and that's got to be the way we do it. And people will believe it when they see it and feel it, and that's the trick. And we're working hard at the Senior Appointments Committee, and I know the Single Service Promotion Boards are working hard to ensure that those who have got that experience have opportunities to promote.
You picked it up as an issue.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. On to Michelle Scroggum.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you here.
You've been very patient.
I know, yeah, especially in this room. It's very hot today. We didn't deliberately turn it up just for you. But I wanted to ask, we were told in November in the House that there's been some new mandatory training introduced for senior military leaders on how to spot and respond to unacceptable behaviour. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that training, what it entails, and also if you've actually completed the training.
So I'm not quite sure specifically what the reference was in the House, and I'm happy to write to you if you provide me with the details. But more broadly, in terms of the raising our standards work, I've been very clear since I started that this is something that needs to be led right at the very top of defence, and as the head of the Military Strategic Headquarters, I need to lead the chiefs, and I've committed to us meeting frequently to consider the overall programme and the progress we're making against it. There are 5 elements that I see to the programme. The first of which is about leadership. It's about leadership from the most senior levels, but right across the organisation. And one of the benefits to Ms Baker's question is that with the new model under defence reform is that we can be more directive about a single approach to leadership right across defence. And as we roll that out through this thing called the Leadership Edge framework, that's about good leadership more generally, but good leadership brings an organisation where people feel valued and feel part of the organisation, and that helps reduce the prevalence of any unacceptable behaviour. So leadership, there's a big element around data and analytics, so we understand and can where there are particular hotspots and can track our changes, and also can use that to identify where there might be particular problems with leadership. There's a piece around communications to help nudge and develop behaviours. Some of it is straightforward, and one of the components is about tracking unacceptable behaviours and dealing with them and tackling them properly. But the comms around that and education of our young people coming out of society into the armed forces is a key component. And then finally, there's a strand of work around training and education. So, for example, active bystander training being a key part. I did that a couple of years ago and found that to be a very helpful mechanism, just to give you some tools to deal with that. So I'll be tracking that with the chiefs, but also working closely with our DG, Director General People, and the Vice Chief of Defence Staff to drive that through during my time as CDS.
I mean, this is generally about women in the armed forces, the unacceptable behaviour that they've been subjected to for far too long. Yeah. This is new training that's coming in. I'm quite surprised that you weren't aware of the actual training programme itself. Do you understand the message that it sends if you haven't actually taken that on board and completed it yourself?
Absolutely right, but as I say, I don't actually know precisely what training was being referred to, because there's a whole set of training that we have to do as senior officers, which I am in date with and will continue to do and continue to set the right example. This
specifically is about spotting those behaviours and how to respond to them and then support victims?
Well, why don't we work out exactly what it was, and I'll write to you and confirm one way or the other.
Thank you. I mean, on the messaging in general, I would say sometimes it's so well embedded that it's never noticed. And on my first visit to Admiralty House, I would say that was one of the first things that I took away, was the fact that there was a huge portrait on the wall of I think it was the 4th Earl of Sandwich's mistress. This beautiful portrait, but they were glorifying the fact that he'd got a 17-year-old mistress that bore him 5 children while his wife was in a mental institution. And I think some of these messages, they're so embedded for so many years that people walk past it and don't even notice. So I think that kind of training and awareness is definitely much needed. So I would appreciate if you could come back to us on that. We heard in December about efforts to test body armour, specifically for women, about the fit, and rather than it actually injuring our female personnel. Will it be treated as an urgent capability requirement should the armour be proved satisfactory?
There are some very specific connotations around urgent capability requirements, but we would definitely consider it to be urgent. My understanding is that trial has gone well, and we will be bringing that. We are already bringing that into service. There's a special name for it, if you like. I will give you the correct name, but yes, we are bringing that into service.
Is it for the UK, because I understand it is going to be used for Ukraine as a priority, but there hasn't been any mention of being prioritised for our personnel.
So I'm not aware that we would prioritise that for Ukraine over our own people. If we've been through the trial and it works, then we will introduce it across with our people as quickly as we possibly can.
As far as I'm aware, that is the case. That they've said it's going to be prioritised for Ukraine, which wonderful. We'd love to protect the female personnel over there, but I think again, if we're looking at protecting, that is something that should be prioritised for our female personnel in the UK.
Great.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you much. And finally, Calvin Bailey.
Chief Marshal. Finally. In my constituency of Leighton and Wanstead, I've got two wonderful Royal Air Force Cadet Squadrons, 12F and 241, who both have very high levels of ethnic minority people in those units. However, when I look at the services uptake and ability to absorb those young people into the service, it is unjustifiably low, I would say. So what are you doing to address the low levels of service recruitment into the from the ethnic minorities and communities like mine?
The first thing I'd say is that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen an increase in representation in ethnic minorities in the armed forces, which I think is a good thing. My whole approach around recruitment and retention is focused on getting the very best people for the armed forces, because that's what the country needs. And so this is fundamentally, for me, is about operational effectiveness. Now, it seems entirely ridiculous to me that if that is the focus, then we shouldn't. It seems ridiculous to me that should mean that we are unable to attract women and ethnic minorities into the armed forces in the kind of numbers that they are represented across society. What we know from, if I lean on my experience from being in the Air Force, is that there are communities across the UK that have very little contact with the armed forces. The cadets do a brilliant job, actually, with developing that knowledge and understanding. But we have to work with what are called in the system the gatekeepers, the parents, the guardians, the teachers, to sell the armed forces as a place that is important to the nation, where you can have a valuable career and where you can contribute to society.
And so that is what I see. And when I go to those squadrons and I go to units such as my previous Air Cadet Unit 56 Squadron in Woolwich, I see and am swamped by parents that are desperate to help get me personally to facilitate their entry into the services. And to be quite frank, that's not good enough, because we know there are stats that link the amount of contact with the military to the uptake. There is very powerful evidence that is the case, and yet these children and these communities are completely written off because the military approach to recruiting now doesn't take the time to put that effort into trying to bridge that gap and recruiting from them.
So I'm not sure I would share your characterisation that it's completely cut off. I think what I see across the armed forces is a determination, commitment to reach communities that don't have ready access or ready understanding of the armed forces. But we don't do enough of that, and we aren't doing it fast enough. And it remains a source of frustration to me that we don't do better in terms of recruiting.
That's what the community outreach teams were there for, and it's for what the ethnic minority networks were there for, to help provide the service with that understanding. So what are you doing to support them? Because as far as I can see, there's been a significant rowing back on commitment to supporting groups that support themselves within the services.
I think the outreach teams still exist in various forms, and that was a key focus certainly in the Air Force a few years ago, and I know the Army and Navy have similar schemes. I'd have to look at the precise details of those numbers. In terms of the networks, the central government has taken an approach towards refining and focusing the networks across government, particularly in the civil service, but I consider that as part of defence, to try to ensure that they are focused on making the most amount of difference. I think that I had a meeting with the Ethnic Minority Network from Defence back in November, and this was a real concern of those, and I'm in conversation with the Permanent Secretary on how we do as much as we can to support those networks who give their time to ensure that members of that network and community are looked after, but also I would want to help them ensure that they can support us in selling what is a fantastic career for anybody, for whatever their background in the armed forces.
It's also sustaining and maintaining those people within the services, and for those people that can't conceive this, if you're an ethnic minority person and you're sent to Benbecula, you might find some of the issues and challenges that you recognise don't exist in that place, and therefore it's useful so you recognise that the networks remain a valid source of support for the...
Absolutely, networks do vital work, and I find my time with them really valuable.
Brilliant. And when we were in AUKUS, we visited we saw the change of approach that the Australian military is having to its non-Australian passport holders, and they've made significant leaps which are really going to challenge our recruitment measures for those non-UK passport holders. We won't have much time to talk on this, but I'd really welcome your agreement to engage with this as a quite pressing issue because of the high numbers of non-UK passport holders that exist within our military.
Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
And Chief Defence Staff, we'd all commend your efforts to increase the recruitment of ethnic minority personnel, but you will no doubt be aware that in the 2024 annual report from the Service Complaints Ombudsman, it was noted that ethnic minority personnel were overrepresented when it came to complaints relating to bullying, harassment and discrimination, and therefore May of last year, on behalf of our committee, I did write to the Secretary of State to raise concerns about incidents of racist bullying and harassment, the use of racial slurs, and the culture in which racial biases disadvantage ethnic minority personnel. Now, what are you going to be personally doing to be ensuring that there is a culture change so that we can deal with the problems at the moment within the armed forces and then therefore recruit more individuals? Because if we don't change the culture at present, then that will have a devastating impact on our ability to encourage more people to join.
Yeah. So it starts with personal leadership and setting the right example. It starts with trying to learn and understand from members of the networks the pressures and difficulties that people from particular backgrounds have, educating myself. And then systemically, it's making sure that we have a set of processes and systems that identify, deal with and call out and deal with that behaviour, and that we inculcate that attitude right through the leadership and training systems that we talked about earlier in the process. So I have a personal responsibility to lead as well as I can and educate myself, but I also have a responsibility to make sure the system works as effectively as possible. And that raising our standards work, whilst it may have come initially out of women in defence. It actually applies to everybody in defence. It's about making us as good as we can be, getting the best out of our people so we can attract and retain the very best people so that we can be the very best armed forces we can be. And that is the business reason for doing it, not just the ethical reason and moral reason for doing it.
Thank you very much. Chief Defence Staff, you have been very, very generous with your time. And you've been in the hot seat for now over 2 hours, so you have earned a well-deserved break, but please do note that you have our very best wishes as a committee, and where, despite the questioning today, we are very much on your side, and we wish you the very, very best in your service, and thank you very much indeed for your service, and please do convey to our brave servicemen and women our gratitude for their service. So with that, I bring today's meeting to a conclusion. Order, order.